Emily sat by the kitchen window, gazing at the garden her mother had tended with such care. It had been 3 years since her mother's passing, and the roses still bloomed as if waiting for her to return. Their scent filled the air, a constant reminder of the gentle love that had once enveloped the house. Emily's father, Richard, had struggled after her mother's death, but they had leaned on each other, sharing memories that made them feel like she was still with them. But now, everything felt different. The house, once full of warmth and laughter, seemed cold, empty, even though it was now occupied by a new person. Emily glanced over at the living room, where Vivian, her father's new wife, sat elegantly on the sofa, sipping tea with a refined air. She was everything Emily's mother had never been: reserved, calculating, and distant. Vivian's eyes followed Emily's every move, always watching, always judging, as if Emily's mere presence was a burden. When her father first met Vivian, Emily had tried to be understanding. After all, she wanted her father to find happiness again. She had convinced herself that maybe she was just being protective, that no one could ever replace her mother in her father's heart. But over time, Vivian's true colors began to show. Emily quickly realized that Vivian wasn't interested in creating a family, but rather in controlling it. "Emily, dear," Vivian called out in her cool, clipped tone, "would you mind clearing the dishes from dinner?" Emily clenched her teeth, but forced a smile. "Of course," she replied softly, though she knew it wasn't a request. It was an order. Vivian never missed a chance to remind Emily of her place. Every task, every comment seemed to belittle her, as if Vivian was slowly erasing her from the home she had grown up in. Richard, blinded by his affection for his new wife, rarely noticed the tension. He seemed to believe that everything was fine, that they were all adjusting, but Emily could feel the cracks forming beneath the surface. After dinner, Emily retreated to her room, her heart heavy with frustration. She missed her mother more than ever. She missed the way she and her father used to talk, used to laugh without the uncomfortable weight of Vivian's presence hanging over them. Late that night, Richard knocked on her door. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice warm but tired. "How are you holding up?" Emily tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Dad." He sighed and sat down on the edge of her bed. "I know it's been hard with Vivian and everything. She's trying, you know. She really cares about us." Emily nodded, though her stomach twisted at the words. "I know, Dad. I'm trying too." Richard smiled and patted her hand. "That's all I can ask for. Just try to get along with her. For me." She nodded again, but the knot in her chest only grew tighter. She wanted to tell him the truth, that Vivian was cold and manipulative, that she didn't care about either of them, but she couldn't. Richard seemed happy, and the last thing she wanted was to add to his grief. So, as always, she stayed silent. Weeks passed, and the tension between Emily and Vivian grew thicker with every interaction. Vivian's quiet jabs became sharper, her coldness more pronounced. She would casually mention how things had been so much more organized before Emily's mother passed, or how much easier it would be if they didn't have to accommodate so many people in the house. One evening, as Emily came down the stairs, she overheard Vivian and her father talking in hushed voices. "You know, Richard," Vivian said softly, "the house is too big for just the two of us. Emily's grown up. She's independent now. Maybe it's time she thought about getting her own place, starting her own life." Emily froze in place, her heart pounding. Was Vivian seriously suggesting that she move out? Richard hesitated. "I don't know, Vivian. This is her home too." "Of course," Vivian replied smoothly, "but it's time for her to spread her wings, don't you think? She'll be fine. She's a smart girl." Emily could hear the subtle manipulation in Vivian's tone, but she prayed her father would see through it. But when she peeked around the corner, she saw him nodding, the doubt in his eyes slowly being replaced with agreement. "I'll talk to her about it," Richard finally said. Emily's chest tightened. She felt like the walls were closing in around her. Vivian was winning. She was pushing her out of her own home, out of the life she had shared with her father. It felt like a betrayal, not just from Vivian, but from Richard too. The next morning, Richard sat Emily down at the kitchen table. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. "Emily," he began, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time you considered getting your own place." She stared at him, the words stinging like a slap. "Dad, what are you talking about?" He shifted in his seat. "You're a grown woman now, and I think it's time you had your own space, your own life. Vivian and we need some time to ourselves too." Emily felt her heart shatter. She had always feared this day would come, but hearing it from her father's lips was worse than she could have imagined. "Are you asking me to leave?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard reached for her hand, but she pulled it away. "No, I'm not asking you to leave. I'm just suggesting that it might be good for you to have some independence." Emily stood up, fighting back tears. "Independence? Or are you just trying to make things easier for Vivian?" Richard's face fell, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw a flicker of realization in his eyes, but it vanished just as quickly. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he said softly. But the damage was done. Emily turned away, her heart aching with a pain she hadn't felt since her mother died. The home she had once felt safe and now felt like a prison. As she left the room, she could feel Vivian's cold gaze following her, victorious. Later that evening, while Emily lay in bed, her thoughts swirling, something strange happened. She heard Vivian speaking on the phone in the next room, her voice low and hurried. Emily couldn't make out the words, but there was something off, something secretive. Instinctively, she pressed her ear to the wall, straining to catch any clue. "I know what I'm doing," Vivian whispered. "Once he's gone, it'll all be mine." Emily's blood ran cold. Gone? Who's she talking about? Her father? She felt a chill creep up her spine as the pieces of a disturbing puzzle began to form in her mind. Something was terribly wrong, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Vivian was hiding something dangerous. And Emily knew she had to find out the truth before it was too late. The days following Richard's unsettling conversation were a blur for Emily. She tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the undercurrent of tension that now filled the house made it impossible. Vivian's presence loomed larger than ever, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Each time she saw her father, a wave of guilt washed over her. He looked more tired lately, his face paler, his eyes duller, like a man carrying the weight of something he didn't fully understand. Emily wondered if her suspicions about Vivian were feeding her paranoia, but she couldn't forget that phone call, the cold whisper of "once he's gone." Emily had to be sure. She had to protect her father. One evening, after dinner, Richard retired early to bed. Emily noticed how quickly he excused himself, how sluggishly he moved. He hadn't finished his meal, and there were faint dark circles under his eyes that seemed deeper than before. As he shuffled down the hall, Emily sat alone at the kitchen table, her mind racing. Vivian entered shortly after, her usual expression of cold detachment firmly in place. She made her way to the cabinet, rummaging through the shelf until she found Richard's medication. Without looking at Emily, she prepared a glass of water and crushed a pill into it, her movements swift and precise. The sight sent a chill through Emily. She had watched her father take that same medication for years, but something about the way Vivian was handling it now filled her with dread. "You shouldn't worry so much, Emily," Vivian said suddenly, her back still turned. "Your father's been under a lot of stress. He needs rest, and I'm making sure he gets it." Emily didn't respond, watching as Vivian stirred the water with care, almost like she was performing a ritual. The glass was placed on the counter, ready for Richard when he woke later. The tension in the air was suffocating. Vivian's eyes flicked toward Emily then, sharp and calculating. "He'll be fine, as long as everything stays calm around here." It was a warning, thinly veiled behind her polite words. Emily swallowed hard, her mind screaming that something wasn't right. The pieces weren't adding up. Richard's increasing fatigue, Vivian's secretive phone calls, and now the strange way she was handling his medication. Could she really be capable of something so dark? Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm going for a walk," she muttered. Vivian's eyes followed her with cold amusement. "Do be careful, dear. It's late." Emily nodded tightly, her heart pounding, and hurried out of the house. The night air was cool and crisp, but it did little to calm the storm inside her. As she walked down the familiar streets, memories of her childhood with her father flooded her mind. She remembered him pushing her on the swings at the park, teaching her how to ride a bike, always there with a smile. He was her rock, her protector, and now he seemed so fragile. She couldn't lose him, too. The next day, Emily decided to take action. She needed proof, something concrete to either confirm or dismiss her fears about Vivian. Her father's life could be at stake, and she couldn't afford to be wrong. That afternoon, after Vivian left for her weekly shopping trip, Emily went to Richard's room. The air smelled faintly of lavender, the same scent her mother had always loved. It was a bittersweet reminder of what they had lost, but Emily couldn't dwell on that now. She needed to find his medication. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the drawer of the bedside table. There, in neat rows, were the bottles of pills that her father had been prescribed. The labels were familiar, but Emily knew she needed to dig deeper. She pulled out her phone and quickly searched the name of the medication. Her heart stopped when she read the side effects. It was a common prescription meant to help with heart conditions, but the dosage, it could be fatal if tampered with. Emily's stomach twisted. Was Vivian altering the medication? Was she slowly poisoning her father, ensuring that his condition worsened? Emily felt sick. She couldn't prove anything yet, but the suspicion gnawed at her. She needed help, someone who could guide her, someone who could see the things she might be missing. That evening, she called her friend Daniel. He had been one of her closest friends since high school, and if there was anyone she trusted, it was him. "Hey, Emily," he said warmly as he answered the call. "What's going on?" "It's been a while." Emily hesitated, unsure how to explain everything. But she didn't have time to soften the blow. "Daniel, I need your help. It's about my dad. I think something's really wrong." There was silence on the other end. Then Daniel's voice, now serious. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Emily told him everything about Vivian, the phone calls, her father's declining health, and the strange way Vivian was handling his medication. As she spoke, the weight of her fear pressed down on her chest. Saying it out loud made it all the more real. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Emily, that sounds serious. Have you talked to your dad about any of this?" "I've tried," she said, her voice cracking. "But he doesn't see it. He thinks Vivian cares about him, that she's helping him. But I know something's wrong, Daniel. I can feel it." "I believe you," Daniel said softly. "Look, I know a guy. He's a private investigator. He's helped people before in situations like this. When something feels off, but you don't have the evidence yet. I can put you in touch with him if you want." Emily nodded, even though Daniel couldn't see her. "Yes, please. I need to know the truth before it's too late." A few days later, Emily met with the investigator Daniel had recommended. His name was Jack, a sharp-eyed man in his early 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor that put her at ease. They met in a quiet cafe, far from the prying eyes of Vivian. Jack listened carefully as Emily explained the situation, his brow furrowing in concentration. "It sounds like you're dealing with something serious here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If your suspicions are correct, we need to move quickly. I'll start by looking into her background, see if there's anything in her past that might explain her behavior." Emily nodded, her heart pounding. "What about my father's medication? I don't know how to prove she's been tampering with it." Jack leaned forward, his gaze intense. "We'll need to get a sample of the medication she's been giving him. I can have it tested for anything out of the ordinary, but we need to be discreet. If she catches on that you're investigating her, things could escalate." Emily swallowed hard. The thought of Vivian finding out terrified her, but she had no choice. She had to protect her father. Jack stood, slipping his notebook back into his coat pocket. "I'll be in touch once I have more information. In the meantime, try to act normal around her. Don't let her know that you're suspicious." Emily nodded, her chest tight with anxiety. The battle for her father's life had begun, and she had no idea how deep the darkness surrounding Vivian truly went. As she left the cafe, a sense of determination settled over her. No matter what it took, she would find the truth. And when she did, she would stop Vivian before it was too late. But as she headed home, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. The text was short, and it sent a chill down her spine. "Stay out of this, Emily. You don't know what you're getting into." Her heart raced as she stared at the screen. Someone was watching her. The message haunted Emily for the rest of the night. She read and reread it, her hands trembling as the reality sank in. Whoever had sent it clearly knew about her suspicions, and they wanted her to back off. Fear gripped her, but there was no turning back. Her father's life was at stake, and she couldn't afford to be afraid. Not now. The next morning, she tried to shake the unease that lingered from the message. Jack was already working on investigating Vivian, and Emily knew she had to play her part. She would keep up the charade, act like nothing was wrong, and wait for Jack's findings. But as she descended the stairs into the kitchen, she couldn't help but feel like she was walking into a trap. Vivian was already there, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. Her movements were graceful, deliberate, and every step felt like it had been rehearsed 1,000 times. When she noticed Emily enter the room, her smile was as cold as ever, but this time, it seemed sharper, more calculated. "Good morning, Emily," Vivian greeted, her voice smooth like silk. "I was just about to bring your father his tea. He's still feeling a bit under the weather." Emily forced a smile, trying to hide the panic twisting in her gut. "Good morning, Vivian. How's Dad doing today?" Vivian's smile remained fixed, but her eyes darkened. "He's resting. I'm making sure he gets all the care he needs." She turned back to the counter, stirring something into a cup of tea that Emily couldn't quite see. Her heart raced. Every instinct told her to snatch the cup from Vivian's hand, to demand to know what she had just added. But Emily knew she couldn't be rash, not without evidence. Jack had warned her to play it cool, and despite the overwhelming urge to confront Vivian, she kept her composure. "That's good," Emily replied, her voice steady. "I'll check on him later." Vivian nodded, her eyes briefly meeting Emily's before she picked up the cup and made her way toward the bedroom. Emily stood frozen for a moment, watching her go, a deep sense of dread settling over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. That afternoon, Emily met Jack again, this time in a secluded park on the outskirts of town. The autumn leaves rustled in the breeze, their vibrant colors a sharp contrast to the dark cloud that hung over Emily's thoughts. Jack was waiting on a bench, looking as serious as ever, a folder in his hands. "I've found something," he said as Emily approached, his voice low. Her heart skipped a beat as she sat down next to him. "What did you find?" Jack opened the folder, revealing a collection of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. "Vivian's past is murkier than I expected. She was married before, twice, actually. Both of her husbands died under mysterious circumstances." Emily's blood ran cold. What would happen to them? Jack pointed to one of the documents, a coroner's report. The first one, a man named Charles, died from what was reported as a heart attack. He had a pre-existing condition, so no one questioned it at the time. But the second husband, Peter, his death was more suspicious. He fell down a flight of stairs in their home. The police ruled it an accident, but according to the report, there were no signs of him tripping, and he was in perfect health. Emily felt her stomach churn. How did she get away with it? Why didn't anyone investigate further? "Vivian's good at covering her tracks," Jack replied grimly. "Both times, she played the grieving widow perfectly. No one suspected her because there was never any concrete evidence, just strange coincidences. After Peter's death, she moved out of state, changed her name, and reinvented herself. That's when she met your father." Emily's hands shook as she processed the information. It was worse than she had imagined. Vivian wasn't just cold and manipulative. She was dangerous. and now she had her father in her sights. "We need proof," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something that ties her to what's happening to my dad." Jack nodded. "That's where the medication comes in. If she's been altering his dosage, we'll need a sample of the pills she's been giving him. I have a contact at a lab who can analyze it for any tampering." Emily thought back to the glass of tea Vivian had prepared that morning, the way she had so carefully stirred something into it. "She's been giving him his medication herself," she said. "I'm sure of it. I can get you a sample." Jack looked at her closely. "Be careful, Emily. Vivian knows you're onto her. That message wasn't an empty threat." Emily nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "I'll be careful, but I need to do this. My dad's life depends on it." That evening, Emily waited for the perfect moment. After dinner, Vivian excused herself to make a phone call, leaving Richard in the living room, half asleep in his chair. Emily's heart raced as she slipped quietly into the kitchen and opened the cabinet where Vivian kept her father's medication. The bottles were neatly arranged, but something was off. There was an extra bottle, one that Emily had never seen before. It had no label, just a plain white container with a few small pills inside. Her hand shook as she opened it, examining the pills closely. They looked different, smaller, more potent. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Emily's pulse skyrocketed as she quickly closed the bottle and shoved it into her pocket, just as Vivian entered the room. "What are you doing in here?" Vivian asked, her eyes narrowing. Emily froze, trying to think of an excuse. "I was just getting a glass of water." Vivian's gaze flicked to the cabinet, but she said nothing. Instead, she walked over to the counter, picking up the cup of tea she had prepared for Richard. "Your father needs his medication. I'll take it to him." Emily watched her carefully, her heart still racing. She couldn't let Vivian suspect anything. Not yet. "I can take it to him if you want," Emily offered, her voice as calm as she could manage. Vivian's eyes darkened. "That won't be necessary." Emily's throat tightened. Vivian knew. She knew Emily was onto her. And now, more than ever, Emily had to be careful. As Vivian left the room, Emily clutched the bottle in her pocket, her mind spinning. She had the sample. Jack could have it tested, but it wouldn't be long before Vivian realized what was happening. The clock was ticking, and Emily knew that if she didn't act fast, she might lose her father forever. The next day, Emily met Jack once more, handing him the bottle with shaking hands. "This is it," she said, her voice barely steady. "This is what she's been giving him." Jack took the bottle, his expression serious. "I'll have it tested immediately. If there's anything suspicious in here, we'll know soon." Emily nodded, feeling both relief and dread. She had done her part. Now, all she could do was wait. But as she returned home later that evening, her phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. "You shouldn't have done that. Now there will be consequences." Emily's breath caught in her throat as a wave of terror washed over her. This time, there was no mistaking the threat. Someone was watching her, and they were ready to strike. She had entered a dangerous game, and now there was no turning back. Emily's heart raced as she stared at the new message. She could feel the fear tightening around her chest, but this time, it wasn't just fear, it was urgency. Vivian knew. Whoever was sending these messages was getting closer, and Emily knew she had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and everything could spiral out of control. The next morning, the house felt eerily still. Vivian moved through the kitchen with her usual cold grace, but there was something different in her eyes, a glint of calculation that Emily couldn't ignore. Richard was still asleep upstairs, his condition worsening each day, and the weight of it all pressed down on Emily like a storm ready to break. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. Later that afternoon, Emily received a call from Jack. His voice was grave, the kind of tone that confirmed her worst fears before he even spoke the words. "I had the pills analyzed," Jack said. "There's something in them that shouldn't be there. A compound that, when taken over time, can mimic the symptoms of a natural decline, fatigue, weakness, confusion. If Vivian's been giving him these pills, she's been slowly poisoning your father. Emily felt the ground shift beneath her. The truth she had feared for so long was finally in front of her, and it was worse than she had imagined. How long? How long could this go on before it becomes irreversible? She asked, her voice shaking. It's hard to say, Jack replied, but your father doesn't have much time. You need to get him away from her, Emily. We need to bring this to the authorities, but you can't let Vivian know you're onto her. Not yet. Emily clenched her fist, rage and panic warring inside her. How could Vivian do this? How could she take advantage of a man who trusted her so deeply, who had given her a place in their lives? Emily couldn't wait any longer. She had to get her father out of that house. But how? That evening, Emily paced her room, running through every possible scenario in her mind. Her phone buzzed again. She flinched, fearing another message from the unknown number, but it was Daniel. He had been her rock through this nightmare, and seeing his name on the screen brought a wave of relief. Hey, she answered, her voice tight. Hey, I've been thinking, Daniel said. You can't stay there much longer, Em. This is getting dangerous. Jack has the evidence, right? So why don't we go to the police? I can't. Vivian's smart. If she sees me making any sudden moves, she'll know. I don't know what she's capable of, but I can't risk it. Emily's voice trembled. What if she hurts him before we get a chance to stop her? There was a long pause on the other end. Then we have to get him out quietly, Daniel said firmly. We'll say he's being taken for a routine checkup or something. Anything that gets him away from her without raising suspicion. Emily nodded, knowing he was right. But pulling it off without Vivian knowing would be nearly impossible. Suddenly, a thought crossed her mind. The doctor, she said aloud. Dad's got a doctor's appointment tomorrow. Maybe we could use that. Daniel caught on immediately. Yes, tell her you'll take him. It'll look normal. And while he's there, you can tell the doctor what's happening. Get him admitted, far away from Vivian. Emily felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The next morning, Emily approached Vivian cautiously. She knew she had to play her cards just right. Vivian, Emily said softly as they stood in the kitchen, Dad has his doctor's appointment this afternoon. I thought I could take him, give you a break. Vivian turned slowly, her expression unreadable. She looked at Emily for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing her words. That's very thoughtful of you, Emily, she said, her voice smooth as glass. But I think I'll take him myself. He's more comfortable with me there. Emily's pulse quickened. Vivian wasn't taking the bait. I understand, but I've barely spent any time with him lately, Emily insisted, keeping her tone light. You've been taking such good care of him. Maybe you deserve an afternoon off. Vivian's lips curled into a tight smile, but her eyes betrayed her growing suspicion. You're sweet, Emily, but I think it's best if I go. I've been handling his medications and know his condition best. I wouldn't want him to get overwhelmed. Emily's heart sank. Vivian wasn't going to let her anywhere near the appointment. She had to think of something fast. Just then, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Daniel. If she doesn't let you take him, I'm coming over. We'll make something up. We'll get him out. Emily swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. She couldn't afford to lose this opportunity. She just needed to stall Vivian long enough. As they sat down for breakfast, Emily noticed her father's frail hands trembling as he reached for his cup of tea. The sight of it broke her heart. How had she let it get this far? How had she not seen it sooner? Dad, she said gently, I was thinking after your appointment today, maybe we could go for a drive. You know, just like we used to. Richard smiled weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. That sounds nice, sweetheart. Vivian's eyes flicked between them, her smile growing tighter by the second. Let's not push him too much today, Emily. He needs rest. Emily ignored her. It'll just be a short drive. I'll make sure he's comfortable. But before Vivian could respond, there was a knock at the door. Emily's heart leapt into her throat. She knew it was Daniel, and she prayed he had come up with a plan. Vivian's eyes narrowed suspiciously as she moved toward the door. Who could that be? When she opened it, Daniel stood there, smiling, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that Emily recognized instantly. "Hey," he said brightly. "I just wanted to stop by and check on Richard. Mind if I say hi?" Vivian's face stiffened. "It's not the best time, Daniel. He's resting." "Actually, I was hoping to take him out for a bit," Daniel continued, ignoring her cold tone. A quick visit to the doctor. Maybe get some fresh air afterward. I've got my car ready." Vivian's eyes darkened, but before she could respond, Richard spoke up from the table, his voice weak but insistent. "I'd like that. It's been a while since I've been out." Emily's heart soared. It was a small victory, but it was enough. She caught Daniel's eye, silently thanking him for the intervention. Vivian's smile never faltered, but the tension in the air was palpable. She couldn't say no without arousing suspicion. "Of course," she said finally, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "But don't keep him out too long. He needs his rest." Emily nodded, trying to hide the relief that flooded through her. "We'll take good care of him." As they helped Richard into Daniel's car, Emily's heart pounded in her chest. They had done it. They had gotten him away from her. But as the car pulled out of the driveway, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, she saw Vivian standing in the doorway, her eyes cold, her expression unreadable. Emily knew this wasn't over. Vivian wouldn't let them go so easily. But for now, they had Richard, and that was all that mattered. As the car sped toward the doctor's office, Emily's phone buzzed again. Another message. "You've made a mistake, Emily. He won't be safe for long." Her blood turned to ice. Time was running out, and she knew they had to act fast. The final confrontation was coming, and Emily would have to be ready for whatever darkness Vivian had left to unleash. The drive to the doctor's office felt like a race against time. Emily's mind spun with the weight of the last message. Whoever was sending those threats was close, dangerously close, and they weren't backing down. As Daniel drove, his jaw clenched in concentration, Emily glanced at her father in the back seat. He looked frail, exhausted, as if the very life was being drained out of him. But at least now, for the first time in months, he was free from Vivian's reach. "We'll get him to the hospital, Emily," Daniel said firmly, his voice breaking the tense silence. "They'll know what to do. Vivian can't touch him there." Emily nodded, gripping her phone tightly, but she couldn't shake the dread gnawing at her insides. The feeling that Vivian wasn't just a step ahead. She was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At the hospital, they wasted no time. Emily rushed to the front desk, explaining her father's condition and handing over the bottle of pills. Within minutes, a doctor came out, examining Richard's vital signs and listening carefully to Emily's suspicions about the medication. "Your father will need to stay here for a while," the doctor said after examining him. "We'll run some tests to see what damage has been done and ensure he's stabilized. You did the right thing bringing him in when you did." Emily exhaled in relief, feeling the weight on her shoulders lift slightly. Richard was safe for now, but Vivian was still out there. She wasn't done, and Emily knew it. She and Daniel stayed with their father as long as they could. Richard had drifted into a peaceful sleep, the tension in his body finally easing as the hospital staff monitored him closely. For the first time in months, Emily felt like she was breathing again. But her phone buzzed again. A message from Jack. "We got her. Meet me at the station." Emily's heart raced. She knew what this meant. It was time to end this once and for all. At the police station, Emily and Daniel sat across from Jack in a dimly lit room, the atmosphere thick with tension. Jack had a folder in front of him, filled with the evidence they had painstakingly gathered over the past weeks. The toxicology report, Vivian's suspicious history, and most importantly, the tamper medication. "We're ready to move forward," Jack said, looking at Emily. "We've notified the police, and they've issued a warrant for Vivian's arrest. It's just a matter of time before she's brought in." Emily felt a surge of relief, but it was tinged with fear. Vivian wasn't the kind of person to go down without a fight. "Do you think she knows?" Emily asked quietly, her eyes fixed on Jack's. Jack hesitated for a moment. It's hard to say, but with the messages you've been receiving, I wouldn't put anything past her. She's dangerous, Emily. She'll try something. Just then, a police officer entered the room, his face grim. There's a complication, he said, his tone urgent. Vivian's gone. Emily's blood ran cold. Gone? What do you mean? We went to the house to execute the warrant, but she wasn't there. One of the neighbors said she saw Vivian leave late last night with a suitcase. We're tracking her, but right now we don't know where she is. A sickening dread settled in Emily's chest. Vivian had slipped through their fingers, and she wasn't just running. She was preparing for something. Emily, Jack said, his voice low, you need to be careful. She might come after you. She knows you're the one who uncovered everything. That night, Emily and Daniel returned to her father's hospital room, the tension palpable. Richard was still asleep, unaware of the storm brewing around him. The sterile smell of the hospital offered a fleeting sense of safety, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Vivian was out there, and if the last few weeks had taught Emily anything, it was that Vivian wasn't one to go down quietly. As they sat by Richard's bedside, the weight of exhaustion settling in, Daniel squeezed Emily's hand. We'll get through this. She can't hide forever. Emily nodded, but the unease in her chest remained. Vivian had vanished just when the police were closing in. Her timing was too perfect. She had to have known. But how? Suddenly, a noise from the hallway startled Emily. She glanced at the door, her pulse quickening, but it was just a nurse passing by, checking on patients. Still, every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. I can't shake the feeling she's coming after us, Emily whispered, her eyes darting between the door and the window. She's not done, Daniel. She won't stop until she gets what she wants. Daniel looked grim, but he didn't argue. He had seen enough to know Emily's instincts were right. We'll stay here tonight. Keep your dad safe. They settled into the uncomfortable hospital chairs, both of them trying to stay alert despite the overwhelming fatigue. The minutes dragged on, the quiet hum of the machines the only sound in the room. But in the stillness of the night, something felt wrong. Emily couldn't pinpoint what it was at first, but then she noticed a figure moving outside the hospital, just beyond the window. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood up, straining to get a better look. The figure was heading toward the back entrance. Daniel, Emily whispered urgently, someone's outside. Daniel followed her gaze, his expression darkening. Stay here. I'll check it out. No, Emily said, grabbing his arm. We go together. If it's her, we need to be ready. Reluctantly, Daniel nodded, and the two of them quietly slipped out of the room, making their way down the dimly lit hospital corridor. The sound of their footsteps echoed against the tile floors as they approached the back entrance. Emily's heart was pounding in her chest, every instinct screaming that Vivian was near. As they rounded the corner, they saw the door leading to the back parking lot ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. The chill in the air outside seeped into Emily's bones as she stepped cautiously toward it, Daniel at her side. Suddenly, from behind the door, a shadow moved, and Emily's heart stopped. Before they could react, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Vivian. Her face was pale, her eyes cold and sharp, but there was a wildness in her expression, a desperation that made Emily's blood run cold. Emily, Vivian said softly, her voice laced with menace. I was wondering when you'd show up. Emily stepped back, instinctively placing herself between Vivian and the entrance to the hospital. It's over, Vivian, she said, her voice trembling but firm. We know everything. The police are looking for you. Vivian's lips curled into a sinister smile. You think I don't know that? You've been so predictable. Emily, I've been watching you, waiting for the moment you'd try to turn everyone against me. Daniel stepped forward, his body tense. It's done, Vivian. You can't hurt Richard anymore. It's over. Vivian's eyes flicked to Daniel, her smile fading. You're wrong. It's not over. Richard is mine. Everything is mine. Emily felt a surge of anger. You poisoned him. You tried to kill him. Vivian's eyes flashed with fury. He was weak. He never deserved everything he had. All that power, that wealth. It should have been mine. Her voice grew louder, more frantic. I was doing him a favor, making sure it all went to someone who knew how to use it. You're sick. Emily spat, her hands shaking. You ruined his life. You almost killed him. Vivian took a step closer, her voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. And I'm not done yet. Before Emily or Daniel could react, Vivian lunged at Emily, her hand gripping something sharp, a knife. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing as she struggled to stay on her feet. Daniel grabbed Vivian's arm just in time, wrestling her away from Emily and pinning her to the ground. Call the police, Daniel yelled. Emily scrambled for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. Within moments, she heard the wail of sirens in the distance, growing louder as they neared the hospital. Vivian thrashed on the ground, her face twisted in rage, but Daniel held her down, his strength overpowering her. The police arrived moments later, pulling Vivian to her feet and restraining her in handcuffs. Her eyes blazed with fury as they dragged her away, but she didn't scream, didn't fight. She just glared at Emily, her voice low and venomous as she was led away. This isn't over, Emily. You'll regret this. But Emily didn't flinch. She had fought too hard, lost too much, to let Vivian's words shake her now. Hours later, as the sun began to rise, Emily sat by her father's bedside once more, her heart finally at peace. The weight of the past few weeks had lifted, and though there were still scars, both physical and emotional, she knew the worst was behind them. Richard stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked weak, but there was a clarity in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Dad, Emily whispered, squeezing his hand. He smiled faintly, his voice hoarse but full of love. Emily, thank you. Tears welled in her eyes. But this time they weren't tears of fear or grief. They were tears of relief. You're safe now, she said softly. We're going to be okay. Outside the window, the first light of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. It was a new day, a new beginning, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like the future was hers to shape. She had fought for her father's life, for justice, and now she could finally begin to heal. As she sat there, holding her father's hand, she realized something important. Love, honesty, and determination had brought her through the darkest of times. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. Vivian was gone, and Emily had won.